Hey there, WellPod listeners. Just a quick note to let you know that the episode you're about to hear, while it doesn't feature strong language, it does involve themes that might be disturbing to younger listeners. So if you've got kids with you, it might be best to save this one for when they're not around. But do listen because we're very proud of this episode. It's one of our first, and that means we're new. So if you like what you hear, please do us a favor and write a review. It doesn't have to be long, on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you download your podcasts. We'd really appreciate it. Thanks, and enjoy the show.
The journey reduced them to cannibalism in order to survive because they'd run out of water, they'd run out of provisions. They did draw lots, and Captain Pollard, his young cousin, who he'd been sworn to protect on the journey,
Had drawn the
short straw.
Welcome to The Well. I'm Anson Mount.
I am Brandon Edgens.
And today I'll be sharing an interview I landed while I was working in Hawaii. So Brannon has no idea who this person is.
Nope.
What's the word I'm looking for?
I'm ignorant.
You are ignorant. You have no idea who this person is. Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and tell you that her name is Kelly Gleason Keogh. But she has a job you probably didn't even know existed.
Which is?
A lot of people don't even know that this is actually a profession, and so I'm feeling pretty lucky to have a job in it, but...
I didn't realize it was a profession.
It is.
Yeah, it surprised me too. Care to take a guess at what it is that Kelly does?
History of cannibalism. Cannibalism historian.
Ooh.
Human gastronomy.
Oh, you get it. Well, now you're veering off. Okay, hold on. I'll give you another hint.
You know, if you want a career where you're getting underwater and you're outside and you get to work with the ocean, and maybe a lot of times people will tell you just be a marine biologist, but if, like me, your true passion is history and the humanities.
Marine an anthropologist specializing in maritime and seagoing and maritime adventures and shipwrecks and marooned accidents at sea.
If there were an actual term for this, you would be a winner.
Uh-huh.
And
okay.
There is. And
there
is.
Okay.
I'm going to play it for you.
Maritime archaeology is a great combination of those disciplines.
Oh, I was very close.
You were very close.
I got the word maritime.
You did?
And archaeology just next to each other.
If you just trimmed out the schmaltz. Yes, so Kelly is a maritime historian. She works for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, and she has a particular interest in ships that have been lost at sea. So when she first came to NOAA, she found herself perusing the list of lost ships within her new jurisdiction, and one name jumped out at her. But not because of her science background or even because she's somewhat of an expert on antique sailing vessels. It jumped out at her because she had paid attention in her American literature class.
I picked it up. I mean, in school I read Moby Dick, and it was a story I loved, and, you know, still have my kind of dog-eared copy today.
Moby Dick. It's one of the most read and revered American novels in our history. An epic about vainglorious ambition. Did you read it?
Oh, it's my favorite.
Is it? Really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's a lot of people's favorites. And it was inspired... What?
Screw you.
All right. And it was inspired by the true life story of the whaleship Essex. Now, the Essex is not the ship that Kelly saw on Noah's logs that day, but it is linked to it. And in order to understand the significance of Kelly's ship, we have to understand the significance of the Essex.
In 1821, it set sail with a young captain who was about 29 years old, named Captain George Pollard.
Captain George Pollard, young, ambitious, daring, and our story's hero.
The story of the Essex really is kind of about the human stories on board because, you know, the decisions that were made and then ultimately the tragedy that occurred kind of comes down to how it affected these human beings versus, you know, the story of whaling, I guess. Whaling was the way to wealth at that time. And so these young boys who maybe grew up running around a shipyard.
When you say young, how young?
As young as probably 10 years old were some of the youngest on the
God.
ship.
Yes, you heard correctly. 10 years old. Children on board a whaling ship. But let me put this into context. In the early 19th century, American social classes and economic tiers weren't as fluid as we see them today. If your father was a shopkeeper, for instance, or a farmer or a soldier, chances were that's what you were going to do as well. But whaling was different. Because whale oil was the petroleum of the 19th century. It was used for everything. Lamps, candles, margarine, machine lubricant, glycerin, cosmetics, rust-proofing, soaps, cleaning products, print glazing, varnish, leather tanning, rope processing. It goes on.
Lamp oil.
Whale oil was valuable stuff. And going out on the high seas to actually get this stuff was a way out of the lower classes and into the aristocracy. Because if you made captain, that was a shareholder position. But it was a high-stakes, high-reward game where you faced dangers such as piracy, foreign conscription, random squalls, scurvy, mutiny, and the most feared of all fates.
Unfortunately, they became victims of a terrible tragedy when they were rammed by a whale.
On November 20th, 1820, the whale ship Essex, under the command of a 29-year-old Captain George Pollard, was struck by an angry whale. And when all was said and done, there was nothing left but a handful of men and 3 of the small boats. Captain Pollard and his young sailors slowly began to starve, one of them being his little cousin, a boy with the fateful name of Owen Coffin.
Each small boat had about 4 to 5 men. They all hoped to make it to, initially they were going to try to make it to the Marquesas Islands, but they thought there might be cannibals there. And so they decided instead, let's head to the coast of Peru, which was probably their biggest mistake, because instead of, potentially meeting cannibals, the journey reduced them to cannibalism in order to survive, because they'd run out of water, they'd run out of provisions. They had to draw lots eventually because they needed to try to stay alive. And so in the end,
they drew lots to see who would be eaten.
Yes.
And of course, when the short straw was drawn, it was in the hand of young Cousin Coffin. Captain Pollard sat and watched as a single bullet was fired into the boy's skull. And then they ate him. And not soon after, they were rescued.
Oh, no. That's somehow the worst.
Yeah.
Did he stand trial?
No, when they got back to Nantucket, after eventually 6 of them were rescued, and they made their way back to Nantucket, and even they at that time there was a very forgiving welcome.
Which at first I just couldn't wrap my head around, right? Can you imagine that happening today?
Well, this sort of thing did happen, though. I mean, it exists so far outside of our contemporary imagination. Back then, this was a risk.
Well, what helped me to understand it is Kelly began to explain that these guys basically looked like concentration camp survivors when they got back.
Right.
They were so emaciated and dehydrated that they had entered a mental state some call complete disassociation. Mm-hmm. Do you know what that is?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So they were so far gone, they hadn't even been able to see the rescue vessel when it pulled alongside their small boat, or hear the calls of the sailors from above. And in 19th century Nantucketers, a community that knew intimately the dangers of whaling, they knew how impossible this survival had been. And so they found cause for celebration. Captain Pollard did, of course, have to explain to his aunt that he had eaten her son, and she never spoke to him again. Nonetheless, the whaling community knew what these men had been through. Their outpouring of sympathy and support generated a few stories in the press. But like most things, the story eventually faded. Until 20 years later, when the son of one of the survivors, First Mate Owen Chase, related his father's story to a shipmate of his own, a young man named Herman Melville. And Herman seemed so interested in the story, he gave him a copy of his father's memoir. It was titled Narrative of the Most Extraordinary and Distressing Shipwreck of the Whale Ship Essex. And Herman absolutely devoured it. In fact, he would eventually write these words in the margins of that copy.
The reading of this wondrous story upon the landless sea, close to the very latitude of the shipwreck, had a surprising effect on me.
Well, that effect led to young Herman writing one of our most celebrated novels, Moby Dick, a copy of which, in turn, we already heard Kelly say.
Picked it up. I mean, in school I read Moby Dick, and it was a story I loved, and still have my kind of dog-eared copy today.
But Kelly went on to explain that she had also read another book in her American Lit class.
Daniel Philbrick wrote a book called In the Heart of the Sea.
In the Heart of the Sea is a fantastic book that covers the Essex disaster. It won the National Book Award in 2000, and Ron Howard even adapted it into a major motion picture. It was hugely successful. But at the end of the book, there was this one chapter that she had never heard mentioned by any of the reviewers, any of the academic papers, any of the documentaries and movies.
The Essex story, which is the basis for Moby Dick and inspired Herman Melville to write Moby Dick, didn't end with the wrecking of the Essex. It actually ended with the two brothers. But I didn't really know the two brothers story until reading In the Heart of the Sea, and then after that, having the opportunity to work here and coming across this name Two Brothers and realizing...
Oh, and then you made the connection?
Yeah, not myself. I mean, we knew
Everybody knew that that's what that was.
Yeah, that this was potentially there.
There meaning Kelly's new jurisdiction in NOAA. Somewhere out there could be the last piece of this historic American puzzle, and she wanted to find it. Now, I have to pause here a minute and explain something that some of our listeners might be wondering. Why would the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration have a vested interest in finding historical shipwrecks, much less employ a full-time maritime historian? Were you wondering that?
Yeah, I'm wondering that.
Well, the answer is pretty simple. One of NOAA's major missions is to preserve our ocean ecologies, but most people just aren't that interested in biology or even, sadly, ecology. But what most people are interested in, just like Kelly,
Is buried treasure.
close,
Yeah.
a kind of treasure, stories,
Right.
especially stories of national significance, because in some way, we, all of us, are connected to that story. And when Kelly came across that name in the NOAA logbooks, the Two Brothers, she knew she could be on to another of those stories.
So what were the two brothers?
Funny you should ask.
Because the captain of the Essex is also the captain of the whale ship Two Brothers.
So how does he get a second chance? Where does that come from?
So when Captain Pollard was rescued off the coast of Peru, he sailed back to Nantucket on a ship called the Two Brothers. And so over the course of that expedition, or that journey back to Nantucket...
This is his rescue.
His rescue vessel.
Okay.
So it was a whaling ship headed back to Nantucket. And when they got back to Nantucket, the whaling ship captain said, I think... you need to be the next captain of the ship. And so he decided to
So was the
give
captain retiring? Or
Yeah, it was his time to
and he
cycle
thought
out.
this emaciated guy who just ate somebody.
Yeah,
needed-
and I think even more remarkable that three of the men who survived the Essex headed back out to sea on the Two Brothers. So while Captain Pollard went, so did some of his crew from the Essex. And so whatever he'd done as captain, he'd impressed them enough to make them want to head back out to sea 30 days later. Now that
30 days?
Yeah, just 30 days. So
They're to the point of starvation. They're rescued, and then they head back out in a month?
There were actually 8 survivors, and all of them did go back to sea within a month of their rescue, although not all on the same vessel. But still, several of these sailors did join Pollard aboard the Two Brothers and set sail while still trying to recover from starvation, dehydration, and mental fracture. In fact, there's a question as to whether or not this was the product of sheer madness or sheer ambition. Because They weren't just sailing a few miles out into the Atlantic. At this point, the richest whaling grounds were in Japanese waters. And this is prior to the Panama Canal. So they had to sail all the way down the east coast of North, Central, and South Americas, around Cape Horn, and then north again. It was a 6-month voyage just to get there. And when Captain Pollard and the crew of the two brothers were almost there,
there's an interesting story of interaction at sea. When Pollard heads back out on the two brothers, he runs into another ship, and the captain on board says, are you the same Pollard who was on the Essex? Why are you back out at sea? And Pollard says, well, in Nantucket there's this old adage that lightning doesn't strike twice. At the time, he lost track of where he was when he was passing through the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, and he didn't know if he was close to French Frigate Shoals or Gardner Pinnacles, which are just very close together. And sure enough, in the middle of the night, ran aground on a reef, and the ship ran aground so fast and hard, it basically broke up right away. And the way that the crew described in their account of the wrecking event is that Captain Pollard basically went kind of catatonic. And rather than instructing everyone about what to do, he just completely froze, because I think probably in his mind he was imagining, I can't go through this again. I can't get in a small boat and drift for months and, potentially be reduced to cannibalism again.
the two brothers went down like a lead weight. When Captain Pollard came out of his catatonia, he realized that lightning had struck twice. He had lost 2 ships in 2 consecutive excursions. The only good news was that he was already aboard a rescue vessel.
And the Martha was able to save everyone on board, so everyone was rescued.
No deaths.
No deaths. They head back to Honolulu. But at that time, there's accounts of Captain Pollard saying, no one will ever trust me again. I'm a Jonah man. And Jonah man meaning, he's the unlucky, cursed captain. And so sure enough, when he did make his way back to Nantucket, he was never going to be captain again. And so he became a night watchman. And so he kind of, there's stories of him just wandering the streets at night, lighting the gas lamps of Nantucket. But certainly his social status had totally changed from when he set out as a young man on the Essex.
That's such a 180 for the same community. To
Yeah.
immediately make him a captain of another vessel to suddenly...
Yeah, and I mean it is kind of this, and he, to date, they have never found his grave, so he kind of has this unmarked grave. He was married,
He's
but never
buried in
had,
an unmarked grave.
yeah.
That is so sad.
That first go around, I would have thought he would be as superstitious about heading back out to sea a month later, but I think overlapping that superstition was that kind of drive for profit.
The two brothers, the last chapter of the greatest story of ambition ever told, is lost in the watery depths. Now, flash forward almost 200 years, and in a dusty file room of the NOAA offices on Hawaii's Ford Island, Kelly Gleason Keogh is staring at 2 little words, a time capsule in language that contains a seed of that same human condition that has led to our greatest triumphs and our greatest downfalls. Ambition.
And so knowing that the two brothers was there, it is potentially the most interesting shipwreck site that there is in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands.
What was the key? What was there a map that popped up, or what?
No.
Or you heard somebody saw something? What was the key?
No, well, the way that the ship was discovered was in 2008, and we were doing what's called tow boarding, where you basically drag a snorkeler behind a small boat who just can scan the seafloor. And we were in an area that was a historic anchorage, and so we thought, well, maybe we'll find some artifacts. And sure enough, we came across a huge anchor. And then a second huge anchor. And these are anchors that were way too big to be in an anchorage. This wasn't a ship that was there on purpose. It was an accident.
Because an anchor that size would only be used for a very large ship. say a whaling ship. And a ship that big would never anchor in waters as shallow as the French frigate shoals. And these anchors were covered in so much underwater growth, they were only recognizable to an eye like Kelly's that was trained to look for that exact shape.
Do you immediately think
Well,
this could be it?
Well, I think there was the little part in the back of your head that Two Brothers was one of the oldest ships lost in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. What gave it away as a whale ship were the big heavy iron tripods that we came across.
So all of a sudden, Kelly, she's floating about 10 feet underwater, holding her breath, and she's starting to see a geometry in the ocean floor made of these individual shapes that all look like different tools of the whaling trade.
What you really hope to find is something like a ship's bell with the name on it that'll tell you immediately this is the Two Brothers, but we didn't have that.
In other words, Kelly needed a smoking gun. Incontrovertible proof that this was the Two Brothers and not just some other shipwreck no one had known about. And there were only a few items at that time that would have the ship's name emblazoned upon it. The ship's bell was missing. They found a few tripods, those big cast iron pots that were used to render down the whale blubber, but no name there either. So that left
Whaling harpoons. And whaling harpoons, they'd have maybe 80 on board any given whale ship in the 1800s, but you rarely find them on whaling ships. I've never really seen them before. And those are exciting because each whaling ship would have etched the name of the ship in the harpoon. That was their way of claiming ownership of a whale if it got away. And so with the Two Brothers site, it was about a year after it was discovered, we headed back and we came across whaling harpoons.
So they gathered up all the harpoon blades they could find in that area of the shoals, took them into the lab, and nothing.
No writing.
Nothing. No name. They couldn't even find a blacksmith's insignia. They were totally, disappointingly blank. No identifying markers. But they still held pivotal information.
These are, in addition to potentially having the markings of the ship, they're also a technology that you can tie to a specific time period and place. And so these were all whaling harpoons that would have come out of Nantucket in the 1820s. And so at that time, there were no archival records of any other ship coming out of Nantucket and being lost in that area. And so
by process of elimination,
with the preponderance of evidence, every expert we consulted with, and then digging through records to find any other ship that it could have been, we were able to come to the conclusion where we said this is the Two Brothers and shared it with the public.
And that's when Kelly and this little NOAA office on this little island in the middle of Pearl Harbor suddenly became globally famous.
It was picked up by the New York Times, became interested in it. That was one way it got out, but it was remarkable how, outlets in Germany and, everywhere else that really picked up on the story, and it kind of, I think, spoke to how universal the Moby Dick story is, that people can really connect with that story and just have an understanding of its significance.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's, I think as far as American literature goes, it's just an incredible story of, the Ahab character is this, kind of pursuit of something that to the point of madness. And
Yeah.
And
Is there ever a moment where you see something really enticing and you want to go for it and just safety concerns or hold you back?
Yeah, certainly. And I do a lot of deep technical diving with my work. So there have been moments where you really have to defer to safety over whatever mission you're trying to accomplish too. And that's something as a scientist you often have to remember, is that, while you're underwater trying to conduct this work, it's really easy to get carried away with the excitement of doing more, recording more, going to that last little bit of the site, but
Holding onto the rope.
yeah, but at the end of the day, you're in a totally foreign environment underwater, and so you need to remember that the mission is less important than staying alive.
Don't be Ahab.
Yes. So.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess I was pushing the metaphor a little bit there in that part of the interview.
Not necessarily. I could see Ahab as a researcher.
Oh.
Yeah, with the death grip on a result that he's looking for.
What was your biggest takeaway from Moby Dick? I mean, what did it?
Hubris, sure, but hubris is takes a lot of forms, and Moby Dick is specifically man against God. It's the arrogance that you're going to dominate a power that is so much larger than you, and there's, depending on your frame of reference, it almost starts to look comical. And it's what I like about the book. It dive in on the macro level, and you watch these characters who are basically the 19th century equivalent of astronauts. The sea was deep space, and to them, like, we're very comfortable about this now. We think about it now. We get on cruise ships, and it's nothing but everyone getting drunk and eating lobster for 2 weeks, and no one even thinks about it.
Right.
We're so comfortable on the high seas, and we think, we've dominated this.
Right.
We have no fear and no humility about this at all. That was not the case back then. It was frequently that boats were stowed and sank, and which is why at the end of all of the noise and violence of Moby Dick, there's this absurd moment. It's totally absurd while they're sinking, and he hammers the balloon into the mast, and he catches a flying bird between the hammer and the nail and kills that too on the way down. And then it's just all this violence and noise. And then I can't remember, but the last words of the book are, "And the sea rolled on as it had for millennia." Like, nobody cares. The sea erases everything.
Yeah, one of the biggest takeaways from me from my American literature class is that there are, in general, 3 types of novels: man versus man, man versus nature, and man versus himself. And I think that the artistic and technical genius of Moby Dick is that it somehow becomes all 3.
Yep. Because to go there completely and imagine the reality of that moment is the worst nightmare imaginable.
Yeah.
And now you have to figure out how to get out of this podcast that doesn't end with the worst nightmare imaginable.
Special thanks for this episode of The Well go out to Martha Chang, who first turned us on to the story. And of course, to Kelly Gleason Keogh and everyone at the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument for being such polite hosts. Theme music by Jonathan Myberg, additional music by Jason Shaw under a Creative Commons Attribution License. The Well is produced, recorded, and edited by Brandon Edgens and myself, Anson Mount. You can also find more information about us and our guests at thewellpod.com. That's thewellpod.com. And if you really like us, go to iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts and give us a review. We'd appreciate it. Have a great day.